This is Nicole Sauce from the Holler Homestead giving you a woman's take on the walk towards independence because we're living free in Tennessee.
Good afternoon, everyone. Today is February 20, 2017, and this is episode 24 of Living Free in Tennessee. Do you ever give someone advice and then realize the person who needs it the most is you? That's basically how last week went here. With the podcast behind me and the newspaper sent to print and a very well-focused priority list as a result of kind of looking over priorities and backing off a little bit so I could really get stuff done, we were going into this coming weekend with a little bit of joy, and then something changed. The ducks discovered the creek, and this resulted in a cascade of a series of high priority projects that had to be done in order for the ducks not to die. Because when the ducks discovered the creek, they did not keep coming home to their safe coop at night. Like if they just go to the creek and poke around and come back, I don't care. They wanted to sleep in the water, and the coyotes like to eat ducks at night. So we were running all over the place all week to try to keep these animals safe. I did let them hang out there for a while because it was sort of like, you know, what are you going to do? The ducks in the creek. It's having a great time. But what that meant is that all my carefully laid plans were turned upside down. So we'll talk a little bit about that later in the episode. Today I will also cover something promised from last week, which is potato preservation. We'll go over questions to ask as a result of reading Chapter 6 of Toby Hemingway's Gaia's Garden. And there is going to be a very short, but first in a series of gardening economics discussions. And of course, the Dances with Ducks series will be at the very end today, so you can, plan things differently on your homestead than I did, perhaps, or maybe just have a little realistic view into what happens when you keep animals. Because basically keeping animals does mean you can't depend on any plan you've ever hatched up, ever, no matter how much you think you have it all together, going exactly how you want. And animals, for me, if like a blueberry bush dies, I'm not going to freak out, but I don't want to kill 16 ducks because I left them in a creek and they became coyote snacks. Speaking of not having it all together, we got this one in last week from one of our new listeners. The person said, I just heard the beginning of episode 19. Check out Justin Rhodes' chicken tractor. I think this is exactly what you're looking for. So this listener must have heard me talking about my failed chicken tractor collection. And he or she provided a nice link to DIY chicken tractor plans, which I've put in the show notes. And since I've heard from several of you about having similar chicken tractor challenges, I thought it would be really good for you to check that out. And also, Justin Rhodes is a wonderful resource if you are just starting with poultry because he shares his whole experience in raising chickens. And it's a little bit better than, like, most of the resources I find on raising poultry are bullshit. They basically talk about, keeping your precious little chicken from the time you get it, like the chick, really, really warm for 6 weeks, and never letting them out. And that, in my experience, that just results in a lot of poop and not a lot of chickens eating greens. I've found I can put as long as it's warm enough outside, we can put them outside after week 1 very easily. And it tends to make them grow stronger and faster. So it doesn't mean that they go out unsupervised or unprotected, but anyway, Justin gives you a more realistic assessment than some of the well thought out, commercially oriented guides that have then been adjusted for home chicken raising, which I just think totally missed the boat on what it's really like to raise poultry. Of course, the best way to learn how to raise poultry is to raise poultry, and you will find yourself quickly becoming an expert if you care about animals and pay attention to them every day. And before we head into our regular segments, remember, if you want to drop me a question or a topic idea or a comment, just hit me up at email at nicolesauce@gmail.com. Or you can, of course, always leave a comment over at livingfreeintennessee.com. And if you are one of those folks who prefer to listen to podcasts on YouTube, I don't know who you are, but I guess there are some of you. We are finally there. I figured out how to drop a photo in and put the audio behind it. So we now have a very boring to watch, but if you're interested in the podcast and like listening to it, it's exactly this information that I'm giving you right now. It's over on YouTube, and I put a link to that also in the show notes because I'm not allowed to get my own custom URL until I have 100 followers. So if you're a YouTube listener and you want to help me out, go follow me. I have to have 100 followers for a month before I can have the, /live free TN or whatever we're going to do over there. And I've already heard back from one of you who is also the one who requested I go on YouTube. So apparently a couple people have listened. We'll be playing with the YouTube page a bit more on and off over the next few weeks. It was not in my original rollout plan to launch this soon. And I may eventually set up a camera in the office and just go straight to YouTube. So it's a little bit more automated. You can expect it out on Tuesdays. If I can upload it on Mondays, I will. But Mondays, I dedicate to recording this podcast. Then I go to CrossFit and work out, and then I sing and choir. So I'm not sure that it took, I think, roughly 2 hours for the video to render. And I'm sure as I get better at that over time, I'll figure out a better way to do that as well. So now on to better things. Let's do our first segment, which is eating seasonally. This is where we share what we're eating as it comes to us in Tennessee. And just like in fact, this one's going to be at the top for a while. Wild garlic and watercress are coming on. In fact, yesterday, I was frankly so exhausted from dancing with ducks that we did not harvest watercress. So I will get some of that this afternoon if I get a window between the podcast coming out and heading out. And if not, Tuesday morning for sure, because watercress is tasty and it's looking really good. And the wild garlic's doing really well. So those two things together make a pretty good soup, by the way. They also go well on salads, and salads seem to be the focus of any early spring, and you'll be hearing that as we go through. It's salad season. I just learned that someone can eat a dozen eggs, and that's because we have a ton of eggs. Now, that may sound really shocking to some of you, but it's not. The early chicken eggs are pretty small, so it's probably more like the person ate 6 eggs, but it was shocking when they told me they ate a dozen all at once. We were all kind of laughing about that. And now the next thing that's coming on, this was pretty cool this morning. Dead nettle is ready. So I went out into the yard and saw little dead nettles coming up in my lawn, popped up into the garden, and in my garden beds we have full on ready to harvest dead nettle, which is Lamium purpureum. It's purple dead nettle. I've put a link to it in Wikipedia. If you are not used to identifying wild plants, get to know the plant really well. This one's a low-risk one to learn about. You can also find somebody to show you if you're worried and you want to verify it. Also, when you misidentify this plant, if you do, the thing it's most often confused with is stinging nettle. You'll know when you go to pick it if it's the wrong one. Also edible plant, by the way. So dead nettle is coming on, and the way we eat dead nettle here is by sauteing it in stir fries, frying it up with eggs in the morning. Also, you can eat it fresh on salads. I prefer to pull the leaves off the stems for that one because the stems can be a little chewy. And the way you identify dead nettle, it's like a mint. It has a square stem, and then the leaves grow in bunches, and on the top it'll start turning purple, and then it blooms. And this plant right now, it's blooming in my garden right now, and it's about the size of my pinky nail other places in the yard. So what we can learn from that is where the cabbages were, which is where the chicken poop was put, is a very fertile area, and the dead nettle there just decided it was happy with the whole environment and went nuts. Dead nettle is something that can also be made into a broth. I did find somebody who has tried it as a broth. I've never done that because usually we're eating dead nettle sauteed as quickly as we can pull it out. And there's no reason to make broth with it, especially because there's another thing we're doing in the prepper pantry this week that kind of eliminates the need for dead nettle broth. Although I'm sure if you're looking to use dead nettle for health reasons, broth is a great way to get your dead nettle fix. I also noticed that there was chickweed starting today. So chickweed's really fun to identify. I'll talk about it Next week, a little bit more. I also made a little video, which will be on the YouTube station or channel, that just shows me showing you dead nettle. And there, I noticed that there was chickweed at that time, so I showed you how to identify chickweed as well. I didn't go into great detail on the chickweed. We'll talk more about how to prepare that for eating next week. But this week, we are going to have dead nettle on our salad. We'll probably have some chickweed on our salad. We'll saute it up in our stir fries, or, sauteed potatoes with greens sorts of things. And it's, to me, a huge relief at this point that we're past the winter and getting the greens, because if you're really eating seasonally and don't cheat like I did and go to the store and buy some heads of lettuce because you just can't even, and don't have an indoor greenhouse going for your fresh greens in the winter, it's like the first thing you get is the dead nettle and the watercress and the chickweed, and you can put those all together into a pretty good salad. And then if you put your pickled stuff on top of that, it's tasty. And that's part of how eating seasonally is made fun, right? You're combining the things that are coming on with some of the things you may have thought about in advance and put into your prepper pantry. Anyway, next up we have getting the gardens ready. This is where we share what we're doing to get our food growing operations up and running for the season. And I thought I'd give yet another sweet potato slip update. And this time I'm putting a photo in the show notes for you. That first potato that came out of my garden last year that has rooted out, it's already starting to poke out its first slips. So it looks like we'll have a few sweet potato slips to plant soon. So it's only about, I'd say a little over 1/8 of an inch sticking out of the side, but it's a little nubbin that's pushing out, and that will turn into a stem. And when it's a certain length, I will break it off and I will put it in water and let it root in water for a while before transplanting it. Other people just let them stay on the potato, by the way, and just break them straight off and put them straight in the ground. But I've found if I let it root out, it does much better in transplant. And then I told you last week that the other potato had started to root out, and I have a little bit of bad news. It smells like mold in my kitchen right now because that potato, while it is rooting, and if I leave it there, will make slips, it's also molding. So I've decided just to keep the one successful one going that I like. And this is why I started with 5 or 6 of them to begin with, because usually you have little things like this go wrong when you're slipping out sweet potatoes. And if you want to produce your own slips and not have to spend $1 a slip or 50 cents a slip somewhere else to get them into your garden, then you want to have some redundancy built into that whole situation. The other thing that we're doing to get our gardens ready last week is diddly and squat because of the animal incident that I shared with you earlier. But never fear, flexibility is the key to forward momentum on the homestead and part of what makes life here fun, right? So this week we'll be doing a little bit more in the garden than we anticipated originally, and a little bit less with the animals because we have some things under control there. And I mean, in fact, the whole move we made this week has made gathering eggs a little easier too, which is kind of nice. And I did do some thinking, though. So a lot of what happened for getting beds ready was me thinking, and I sorted out which seeds are going in which order. Like, I've known what plants I'm going to do, but I didn't physically put the packets or bags or boxes of seeds in order of how they're going out. But I did have some time to do that when I was tired from running around herding ducks. And I did that because it takes all of 5 minutes to plant seeds when you have your beds ready, which some of mine are, some of them aren't. And it can be done in between things. Like, I can record this podcast, go for my leg stretching walk that I do after I record the podcast, and then come back and finish producing it. In that 5-minute stretch, I can stretch my legs right up to the garden, take out a packet of peas that's probably never going to give me anything, but I try them every year anyway, and I can poke them in the ground, right? Or I can scatter some seeds for spinach, or I can, water up some trays in the greenhouse for the tomatoes. Like, all of those things can happen. And it doesn't take that long if you have your stations set up and ready to go. So I guess I did make some forward momentum, just not really what I was planning to do. I was planning to get my last few beds up and running with some poop in there so that they'd be ready in a few months. And then I have these wonderful circles of cardboard from our printer to put down in between rows this year. So they're all sitting in a stack on my front porch. Next up, we have tales from the prepper pantry. This is just how we are keeping our winter stores interesting. And winter's almost over, so this segment may be going away soon, or it may not, because we are still eating from the pantry. It's just less. I may just move that up into eating seasonally. I am done with squash. I did 8 weeks of squashes, and in fact, I will be preparing a squash this week because somebody has asked for some Cushaw dishes this week, and I thought that I would deliver on that one. But I like squash. I just don't like it every week, apparently. So I am keeping that in mind as I plan next week. Now, in an end of times scenario, I, of course, will grow squash because it grows like nuts and it stores really well. But I think I'm going to store a little bit less squash next year. We did eat squash every single week, a couple times a week sometimes. It was tasty every time. I've got a bunch of recipes for eating squash that are really good, and I'm going to put those into 2 books, the winter squash book and the summer squash book. So we'll make some little ebooks that have a collection of those recipes for people. But I have to say, done with squash for a while, taking a week off after this Cushaw. And the other thing we're doing in the prepper pantry is the freezer audit. Wah, wah, wah. Notebooks are an awesome thing. You can tape them to your freezer and write what goes in and cross off what comes out, right? Yeah, you can totally do that. Did I do that? No, I didn't do that. I do recommend you do that because then you'll know that you have this many steaks and that many grounds and this many sausages and that many blueberry packets and all of those things. It can really help you get up on using your food. That's the one thing I didn't do last year was keep up on my notebook. It exists. There is a list of things. There are a list of cans of food that I jarred too. But I didn't keep up on the whole pulling it out. And there are multiple people that get in and out of there. And this is when the infamous moldy roll thing happens, right? So at this time of year, I like to audit our freezers and look at what's in there. I don't actually create a documented list at this time. What I'm doing is pulling everything out towards the front that needs to be used up. And here's what I found. I went through one freezer this weekend in between ducking around the property. Ha ha ha. We have elderberries that I haven't used up. I fully intended to make some elderberry cough syrup over Christmas. And because of all the Christmas things that happened with my family, that didn't happen. So I have some of that ready to go, and I can make it now. That's fine. Or I can leave it in the freezer for next year, or I can make elderberry jam, or jelly, actually, which is really tasty. I'll probably do the elderberry jelly because that's been getting eaten up really, really fast here. Might just do elderberry juice, though. I don't know. We also have blueberries that we have not used. I've been storing fewer and fewer blueberries every year because while we love blueberries, we don't tend to eat the frozen ones. However, if I put them out, this is a magic thing that happens in my house. If I put them out where Mark can see them, I will be having wonderful oatmeal breakfasts with some blueberries and other things in it because he sees blueberries and strawberries and suddenly he wants to make oatmeal. So I have been focused on the egg breakfast lately, but oatmeal is probably in our future. There are also a bunch of old bones and pieces. I talked a little bit about that last week when I talked about Holler stew. So we're just pulling out all those pieces of meat we didn't cook either because it takes a little more prep time or because it's something sitting in the back of the freezer that's small. We've got them all towards the front so we can use them up before they go bad. And I also found that, this is probably in everybody's freezer, the dried out roll that nobody's ever going to eat. Somebody threw a roll in my freezer, probably over Thanksgiving because we had all that stomach flu going around for Thanksgiving. And it just kicked around and they're getting freezer burnt. So that's going straight into the chicken bowl and they will love it. And that's what we found. The last thing we found that was really exciting, buried under a whole bunch of green chilies, was a pork shoulder. I knew it was in there, but I hadn't looked at it in a while. So the pork shoulder's out. It is defrosting in the fridge, and I think we might hook up the old wood stove from our cabin to my pig roasting pit and cold smoke this thing. We'll see how it goes. I'm going to brine it up, and I think I just noticed today it's done defrosting, so it's ready to brine, and I'm deciding if I'm going to just dry rub it or brine it with, in a big canning pot full of salty water. And then we will throw it on a rack, and if I can talk my friend down the hill to helping me figure out how to best pump smoke into the pig pit, we might be able to smoke that puppy up there. If not, I'll do my usual I'm smoking it on the grill thing, which works pretty well. But I think a cold smoker will be even better because it'll infuse the flavor really deeply into that meat. We are also doing the sweet potato puree this week, just because we, as I mentioned last week, need to use up the potatoes. And this week we started the green beans as breakfast series. That's right. I like to take the canned green beans and boil them up with a little bacon and some flavoring for dinner. And there's almost always a little bit left over. And there was today. So I just threw that into the frying pan with the bacon chunks still in it and fried it up and then added an egg. It made a great scramble. It's a good way to use up leftovers. And I guess the last thing we're doing this week is remembering that we have pickled things. I grabbed the dilly beans, and they're really good. It's the last jar of dilly beans. I'm always kind of happy when I get to the last jar of something because that means that we really did eat what we canned. And so I pulled that out, and some of the sweet beet recipe from my Aunt Helen that I talked to y'all about last fall. It's really good. And I think I'm going to do more of them. Like, I expected not to like it, but man, it's good. And it's really good sliced on salads. So we're slicing those things up on salads, putting them out as appetizers when we think about it, and generally getting through the pickled stuff, which is not only tasty, but it's good for us. The thing that came up this week with my pantry, though, was just I kind of ran into a bit of organizational dyslexia where there were piles of stuff everywhere. I had stuff out I never use. I had stuff put away that I always use, and I was kind of going nuts. So I started thinking about a new way to organize some of these things. My canned goods are awesome. They're so well organized. I can find anything at any time, but I keep finding butternut squash randomly stuck in corners in the root cellar, and the whole thing with the freezer audit. Hopefully I won't have to do that as much next year. I think the key is put a few less items in the freezer so that I can see what's in there and then have them all like things with like things. Like all the steaks are here. That's actually how the other freezer is organized with the cow in it. We have all the cow parts in their own boxes, and then I have some venison parts in there too. And I can find a steak in a minute there. So just rethinking how we organize some of those things. I would love it if any of you are really good organizers and want to talk about it on this show. I want to talk about how to organize all your preps and stuff like that, because I think as we accumulate and rotate through stock, whether it's toilet paper or macaroni and cheese, what my theory is: load from the back, unload from the front. But sometimes, and that works when I have a dedicated space for it, but sometimes I get in a hurry and I don't do it. And some of you who visited have seen what happens when I end up with the pile of crap in my living room. So any of you who are good at organization, reach out to me. I might interview you on the show. Next up, we have stories from the Holler. There aren't too many stories to share because this episode is one big story, right? But I wanted to talk to you a little bit about what really happens here, for better or worse, on the homestead. One of the things I've noticed about people heading into back to the land or homesteading is we all tell how wonderful it is, and it is. But sometimes you have things that are not wonderful happen. So I'm just trying to share with you what we come across, like the infamous dancing with ducks incident that happened this week, which meant I didn't get to go out of town on a vacation, guys. So it has real consequences beyond what you think. This week, it was 73 yesterday, and my bee mentor stopped by, and we did 2 deep hive inspections. And the bees are doing really well. There's good population. We found brood in both. One of the hives isn't brooding out as much as the other, and we think because the location where it is a little colder that they're a little behind the other hive. I'm probably going to move that hive this week or next. It's not something I've been looking forward to doing. I didn't want to do it and then have it be like negative 20 degrees and bees upset and confused. So I think we're going to move it over by the other hive. But of course, like everything here, there's a cascading series of things that need to happen, starting with, I don't like the hive stand over there. So I want to build a more solid hive stand that has weed control under it so that we don't have the grasses growing up that I have to weed whack. It's not exactly comfortable to weed whack under a hive, by the way. Like, I've crawled around under there with my ricing knife just to avoid having to run the weed whacker near the hives, and that's no fun either. So this is all about making it easy. The hive that is colder also has a moisture problem. Like, we opened it up and it was dripping wet, and there's mold in there. There's not that much mold, and as I looked into what you do with mold, all the experts say leave it in there, the bees will clean it up. It does mold in the winter, but this part of the pooling water, I think the hive was tipped back a little bit, so some water has gotten down in the bottom board. I'll probably replace the bottom board if we have a good day this week and I have somebody who can help me lift it, because I can't lift the hive by myself. I'll probably replace that board just to get the rot out. But what I did today was just put in a little extra. I propped up the top about half an inch. So you put a little half-inch shim under the lid. So the lid is closed, but the airflow is coming through. I had cinched that puppy down for winter because I didn't want them getting cold. But at this point, it's pretty warm. And I'm pretty sure that pooling water is not going to be great for the bees in the long term. So we just added some of that venting. That is my only story from the holler, because the only other story I have to tell is Dances with Ducks, and you're not going to hear that till the end. Okay, so I told you last week that the potatoes in our prepper pantry, there were too many, and that I needed to figure out how to preserve them. And I did. I mean, I knew how I thought I was going to preserve them at the time. I knew how I would have last year, but I thought I'll look around and see if there's any other good ways to do it. And really, it kind of boiled down to two things. It boiled down to canning them or drying them. Now, of course, you can just speed up eating them, and that helps, or make potato soup and freeze it. But really, if you're looking for a longer term storage and you don't want to take up freezer space, it looks like potatoes, the best way is, as I thought, canning and drying. And perhaps you haven't thought about drying your own potatoes in the past. We'll talk about that first, actually, because that's the reason I knew about it is my mother is a hiker, and she dries all of her own meals and brings them on her long trips. And one of the things she spent a lot of time doing was figuring out how to dry which thing. So we'll talk about how to dry potatoes first. Now, the key to drying potatoes is the pre-cooking of the potato. Because as you know, when you slice up a potato and expose it to air, what happens? It oxidizes. It turns brown. Bleh. So, I mean, you could dry it without blanching it or pre-cooking it, but it would look gross and probably not taste that great. So what you do is you boil your potatoes. That's how I cook them. I guess you could roast them, but cook them so that the oxidation problem is eliminated. I like to boil mine until it's almost like parboiling. They're not quite all the way mushy, but they're just off mushy. And then slice them up and put them in your dryer. And you use the vegetable setting on your dryer, which I think is about 105 or so. I'm not sure of the exact number. I should have totally looked that up before starting this podcast. But mine just says vegetables. It's like herbs, vegetables. I put it on the vegetable setting. Meat is hotter. And you dry them. It takes about 8 to 12 hours to dry them if you cut them thinly, or longer if you cut them more thickly. I prefer to have them cut at about 1/8 of an inch or less, because hydrating them is a pain in the neck if they're too thick. Now, for this one, you can leave the peels on. Totally fine. Slice them up, dry them, and then bag them up. I like to vacuum pack them and then store them for future use. Now, another way to do this, though, which is sort of like the advanced series, is to make mashed potatoes. Only don't add milk and don't add butter. Just boil your potatoes, mash them with maybe some salt and pepper and water as the liquid. Don't, try to make them as dry mashed as possible. Then you can spread that out on your fruit roll-up trays and dry them that way. And that's how you get your potato flakes. So these just, rehydrate them into mashed potatoes by adding milk. That's when you add your milk and butter, is when you rehydrate them. it's really an easy way to store your potatoes for long-term use. Now, I do want to talk a bit about storing dry foods and the risks involved with dry foods. So most conventional wisdom these days, modern conventional wisdom, tells you to vacuum pack it and put it in the freezer because they really don't want you to get sick. And I think the reason they do that, two reasons. One, you've just put all this time into drying your food. And if there's any moisture at all in that bag, well, it could mold. Or you could grow our little friend botulism if there's no oxygen in the bag and it's moist. So it's really important to dry your potatoes all the way because they are a botulism risk. If it's dried, botulism won't grow. If you put it in the freezer for storage, botulism also won't grow because it can't. So I think that's why they say that. I have to admit, I store my dried stuff. I make sure it's really dry. I put it in the vacuum packed bags and I store it at room temperature. Sometimes if I'm feeling jiggy, I throw a moisture eater in there just in case there is something. But you know what? There's still moisture in the bag if you have a moisture eater in there. So if you really want it to stay the longest, you can throw it in your freezer, in a section of your freezer that you've organized, unlike me, and pull them out as you need them. You know, maybe have them out exposed to air for a week or two, not a big deal. But at the same time, again, end of world scenario, we may not have freezers. Not that I'm planning on an end of world scenario, but you don't necessarily have to freeze them unless you've done something silly like left moisture in your food. So that's how you dry and store potatoes. I think actually if you have like the big giant 5-gallon bucket and you can vacuum pack that somehow, maybe that would work. I don't know. I don't have that many potatoes, so I'm just putting them in little bags. Next up is canning. Now, we've talked a bit about canning and water bath method versus pressure canning. Somebody freaked me out the other day by telling me what they do with a pressure can thing that does not involve pressure canning. And I was just like, well, if you want to kill your family, great. Potatoes are a low acid food, so you need to pressure can them for safety. And that is because of botulism. I won't go into it here because you've heard me go off on botulism before. We don't want to give that to our friends and family. And here's how you do it with potatoes. Now, you take the potato and you peel it. Even those of you who want to keep the peel, the reason they tell you to take the peel off is guess where botulism lives? It lives in the dirt. If there's one food that's going to be a fairly high risk for botulism toxin or bacteria being in there, it's going to be the potato because it's in the ground with the dirt where it lives. So, you know, a carrot would be another example. It's a root vegetable. So what you want to do is peel that off, you know, wash it really well, then peel it, and then probably rinse it again. And then you cut it into 1/2-inch cubes. Why 1/2-inch cubes? Because they've tested the temperature of the middle of a 1/2-inch cube with a proper food probe to make sure the temperature gets up at the canning times that are published. That's why. Some people do go larger than 1/2-inch cubes. I tend to try to keep my chunks at the size they say. So, you know, you just cut it one way, cut it another way, cut it a third way. You've got 1/2-inch cubes. If they're smaller than 1/2-inch cubes, totally fine. You just don't want to go bigger. And as you're making these cubes, put it in a pot of water. That'll keep it from oxidizing. You can even add a little lemon juice to that if you want to keep it from oxidizing. That way you don't end up with weird looking brown potatoes, by the way, in your jars. And you bring that, you know, when you've got them all sliced up, you bring that to a boil for 2 minutes. I just set a timer, rolling boil, 2 minutes, boom, off. And hot pack your sterilized jars along with 1 teaspoon of salt per quart or a 1/2 teaspoon per pint. As with most canning things, you don't have to add salt. If you are told no salt is allowed in your body, don't add the salt. What the salt does is just help preserve some of the color, and it tastes good. And this is it's a standard ratio of salt. This is what's added to corn. This is what's added to beans. This is what people put in to salt their vegetables if they're going to salt them. If you don't like a lot of salt, you can cut this in half. This is one of those places in the pressure canning where I'm not going to be like, follow the instructions exactly. This is like no big deal. And also the thing to know about adding salt is if you add normal table salt, your water will get milky. Or if you use Himalayan salt, your water will get milky in there as it's canning. So when you look at the jar, it'll be like milky and less clear. Who cares? That's what I say. You can use canning salt if you want. I don't really care about how it looks because it tastes good, and I'm not, I guess when I enter my stuff in the fair, I care, and then I use the proper kind of salt, which is the canning salt. Otherwise, it's just salt, man, and it's doing what salt needs to do. So it also helps preserve some of the texture. So if you like a firmer textured potato, that'll help as well by adding salt. Now you hot pack that in the jars. That means you're taking it right after boiling and putting it in your heated jars. The reason the jars are heated is because shocking the jars from cold to hot can cause jars to break. So you put them in your heated jars. If there's not enough water in the pot you boil the potatoes in to cover the potatoes all the way in the jar, just add boiling water and leave an inch of headspace. Make sure those rims are clean and the tops of the jars are clean. Hand tighten the top and put it in your pressure canner for 35 minutes for pints and 40 minutes for quarts. And that's at 11 pounds. Although I have a dial gauge, so it's 11 on my dial gauge. If you have the other kind, the weighted gauge, it's a little bit different. Now, I put the link to the times because if you're at a higher altitude, you're going to go up to 15 pounds of pressure. So it's up there in the show notes just because I'm below 1,000 feet. So every time I share a recipe, it's the below 1,000 feet. I am very close to if I ran up to the top of the hill, I would be at like 1,200, but right now I'm at 800. So, you have to look at those things just because if you live at a higher altitude, water boils at a different temperature, and therefore the pressure has to be harder on your canning. Those are the ways I learned this week to preserve potatoes. The other way I learned to deal with potatoes was to give them to people. So I was able to give somebody half a box of potatoes yesterday who will eat it up. That was pretty darn exciting for me because I like eating through our stores. And we just have I think we have in total about 50 pounds left. So we'll just continue eating through those. I'll probably dry some up so that when potato season is over and new potatoes are not coming on yet, we have mashed potato flakes ready to go. I am doing some slices, but I'm less likely to use them. You can put those slices, by the way, straight into your stews, and they will hydrate with the stew broth. And it's a great way to keep the potatoes going when they're done with your root cellar. Next up, we have a little comment on lessons learned from Toby Hemingway. Now, for those of you who are new to the show, this is a book called Gaia's Garden, A Guide to Home-Scale Permaculture. It's a really good getting started point if you're going to do a homestead or if you are into gardening or if you want to learn more about permaculture. And I ought to know because I have tried other permaculture books and they sucked. This one's really good. It's a sort of, chapter by chapter gives you something to think about. Sometimes it becomes a little dense in information and I feel like I'm going to go back and read some sections again, but it's a great way to get started. So this week I've read chapter 6. Next week I'll be doing chapter 7. If you listen to former episodes, with the exception of last week, I've gone a chapter an episode, and we're getting towards the end of the book. So we'll be done with this pretty soon. I'll probably package all of these up into one little thing that you can download in the future. This week it's chapter 6, and the topic of this chapter was one of my favorite topics in the whole world, plants. Apparently, I have spent most of my time out here on the Holler Homestead thinking about plants because I like to plant plants that do well in places they do well. And, part of what brought me to permaculture was that I started finding wild plants around, looking at observing like how they grow and what habitat they grow in, and then figuring out how to get those same wild edible plants growing on in my yard. So I'd already started bridging into the permaculture world just by taking lots of hikes. And I have to say, last chapter, the chapter number 5 on water, I think I still love that one the most. But the plant chapter was helpful for me. It was a little less helpful because I've played with a lot of plants and figured out a lot of things about them. So it was a good reminder, and it put a framework to it that was helpful. Planting the plants based on multiple functions is the best approach, and that is talked about in this chapter, meaning like you can plant a tree for shade, but it's also going to help pull moisture out of the air, and it's going to make a different microclimate for bugs, and it's going to pull up nutrients from the earth that make them available to other plants. So things like that. They talk a lot about those sorts of details on different kinds of plants in this chapter. It's really worth a read if you haven't thought much about how you're going to make sure that you have a bunch of plants that provide mulch, or plants that, and how those work with plants that provide shade, and how do you get nitrogen out of the soil to make it available to other plants that need the nitrogen. Like, there's all of these different ways that plants help each other, or foster fungal growth, all sorts of different things going on both above and below the soil. It goes into some good detail on some plants, and it also has some suggestions for edible plants that you may not have thought of that sound pretty good. There's one or two I'm planning to add to my yard this year just because I hadn't thought about that particular plant for that particular function. It even made me not curse my bamboo patch as much that I have over at the Liberty Farm. It talks a bit about fostering wild plants and how that can work in your advantage on your land. And then it even gets into a bit of how invasive species don't necessarily need to be a problem. And that's where the bamboo thing came in. I had no idea. I bought this property with like this tiny little bamboo patch, and you know what happened, right? So somebody walked by and said, "Ooh, that's bamboo." And I said, I thought that was just sort of normal. There's a cane that grows here along rivers that's probably basically bamboo anyway. I don't know the name of the plant, but this one's actually black bamboo that's growing on my other property that was planted there intentionally. The good thing the people did when they planted it is they put it in a water runoff area, and bamboo loves water. So it's sort of staying kind of near the water, but we need to start harvesting the shoots from around the edges. I'll probably start getting in there and thinning it out to use as posts and poles, which is why it was planted. It was planted to provide a barrier for the deer coming up because it's hard to walk through, and it was planted to provide, supports and poles for them to use over. They were doing an organic CSA over there. And it's also pretty much staying put, although I noticed it was starting to get a little uppity. So we're going to have a bamboo day out there pretty soon. Okay, so here are the questions you would want to ask yourself as you're going through this chapter. Maybe ask them before and after and see if it changes. And the first question is, what do you want or need to support with your plants on your homestead? Are you looking for more shade? Do you need forage for animals? Do you need to shelter a windy spot? Is there somewhere that's too sunny and hot that you want to be less sunny? Or the other way, you don't have enough sun? Are you providing food for your family? Do you want to have a nice flower garden that you enjoy? Are you looking for things to keep some sort of pest out? Or on the other side of that, bring a beneficial insect like bees into your property, or wildlife for that matter? Are you looking to attract otters? I don't know. Maybe you are looking to attract otters. So those are the sorts of things you'll want to ask just from that big picture perspective, so that as you're looking through this chapter, learning about the different functions that plants can support on your property, you can start then narrowing it down. And something about this chapter, by the way, is there are lists and lists and tables of plants and what they're good for, and how they like to grow. So it's it's one I'll be going back to a lot as I walk into this particular spring and decide where the comfrey is going and that sort of thing. Another question to ask is, what problems do I have that plants can help with? One problem I don't have, but other people do, would be deer destruction. The deers come bounding onto your property and eat all the things you want. Or sad soil. Sad soil is a problem a lot of us have that the right plants and animal circulation on your property can really help you with. So that's another good question to ask. Question number 3 is, what do I really love? How can I plan my homestead to support the things I really love? I actually really like roses. Have I planted a single rose? Negative. But I do finally have some soil ready to go for that. So that's one of the things I put off, probably because what I love more is growing tomatoes and some of the other foods that we produce here. So just think about, what do you love? Is it, do you like rosemary? Do you like something else? I don't know. Squash? Some of you probably really do like squash and don't get sick of it like I do. Next question I would ask is, what balance of mulching functions, soil loosening, nutrient mining, fungal growth, sparking, and so forth do I need to make my land cyclically viable over time? Like, you want to make it one thing feed another. I use a lot of comfrey leaves as mulch, so I keep spreading more and more comfrey around the property. There are a bunch of other mulching plants listed in this chapter, though, so how can you set that up? I didn't know it. Like, I never realized it. Jerusalem artichokes are a good mulching plant. They're also like a total weed out here, so they're easy to grow. And I was kind of excited about that because we got our wood chipper up and running. By we, I mean Ford got our wood chipper up and running, which means not only, I could chop and drop that plant, but now I can grind it up too, and it makes a little bit more of a dense mulch. So that's another good question to ask. Just like, what functions do you need? Which ones do you have? Which ones do you not have? And then what else are you going to add to your property to make that cycle complete? And then finally, what areas should I develop first with intensive planning versus setting the stage for a longer term play? And this may not be as big a deal if what you're doing is a city lot, but out here I've got 3 acres, and in the far back it's like cedary, mossy, rocky. And closer in, I've got, combination of dirt and rock and blackberries. And then near the house, I have the garden space. I have some really rough clay. And, down below the house, I have a pasture that's just gotten some ducks in it. Well, the reason it's just gotten ducks is I know the soil in the pasture is not very good. And those ducks are going to poop down there. And that'll be awesome. And I'm also going to be adding some, I'm going to be seeding it with different things I want to grow there that will help it improve, including some daikon radish, because there's one area in particular that you can't dig in. And I'm pretty sure that those little radishes, which are really big radishes, will help me. They put down a really big taproot, which helps loosen things up. So anyway, those are the questions of the week from chapter 6 of Toby Hemingway's Gaia's Garden. And next segment is garden economics. Why would I bring up economics? Maybe because of what I do in my day job, right? Well, somebody posted a funny meme about spending $280 on a tomato plant that saves you $6 a year. And it got me to thinking, because I was like, actually, I planted 8 tomato plants last year, and I got all the tomatoes I needed for the year. In fact, we haven't eaten all the canned tomatoes and salsa. I think I just saw the last jar of salsa being opened, and it cost me $8 and some, canning supplies. So I think we disagree on what it saved. Also, buying tomatoes at the store, if they're the good tomatoes, is kind of expensive. So I pushed back, and of course they didn't say anything to me, and I thought, well, how do we make our garden economics work out? Because I think that number comes from somebody who started a tomato plant and had to buy fertilizer and had to build a raised, bed and all this other stuff that you don't necessarily have to do if you just have a piece of land with some dirt. But are there really benefits, and does it really save me money? That was the question I got. And I thought, well, hey, let's just start tracking this year as we go. I've got a podcast. I can look at it every week. There are other benefits if it does cost a little bit more, such as, flavor, the exercise you get while doing it, fostering your own independence to where if the tomatoes aren't at the store, you still have them at your house. But does the math work? And the primary question I want to talk about is, do home gardens save you money? And I know the answer is, it depends. But our whole goal out here at the Holler Homestead is to develop a modern homestead that allows us to have the lifestyle we want, while also providing us with some of our income and or making it so we don't have to spend as much money on the things that we like to have. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to track expenses and income. That means if I sell my tomatoes, I get credit for that. And I'll document also how much we spend on groceries each week. Because the other question is, am I just growing all these vegetables for a bunch of money, not eating them and just eating junk? I may or may not actually talk about it every week, but I will provide updates as we go, probably at least once a month, as well as tricks we're learning on keeping the costs down without costing ourselves too much time. And I'll even admit it when we buy a $7 pizza at Walmart on newspaper week, because it's just newspaper week and that's what we want. So we'll start doing that. So here's where we are so far. I've gotten pretty much all of my seeds. I have a few seeds missing at this point. I have spent $85 on the garden on seeds. I probably spent too much on seeds. I ended up with more packets of tomatoes seeds than I intended in a couple of cases. And you know what that means? It means I'm going to do more trays, and I'm probably going to sell a few plants. So we'll see if I get some credit on that one. And I think I might have to spend another $20 on some soil just for seed starting, although I have a pretty good set of soil on hand. I'm not to the point yet where I make my own dirt out of the ground for seed starting. Like, I found it's a huge time saver for me to just get a bag of seed starting soil or two and put them in the trays, and the plants do really well. I get an organic soil. It's probably not as good as if I just made my own, and maybe I'll try that some year, but there's a time saver there. I don't want to lose my mind investing time in making seed starting soil when I can just buy a bag of it. I also expect to spend about $5 in electricity from now until it's time to transplant. And that's just because, especially with the tomatoes and peppers, if you want good germination, I use these seed starting mats. I've had them for years. And they just raise the ambient temperature about, 20 degrees or so. Sits under the plants, keeps their roots warm. When I put the seeds in the trays, I do it in my kitchen so that there's not a lot of temperature variation. And then I put the mats under and plug them in and wait till they germinate. And then I try to get them into light as quickly as possible. With the way our season's going now, they probably can go from the kitchen almost immediately to the greenhouse, unless we get one of those mid-March freezes. We'll see how that goes. And if that happens, then I just keep them in the house. I am not using grow lights this year again because I'm too cheap to buy them. So that means I don't have to put the money into this little calculation. So all in, it's about $110 so far. So we'll see if that saves me on groceries in the future. We will also see if I don't get the crazy, that seed crazy thing that happens when you're in the garden store and buy more seeds. I don't think I will. It's very hard for me to avoid biting plants and seeds when I'm in the stores just because they look so cool. But I have learned over time a lot of what happens is I buy seeds or I buy plants in that situation on impulse with no idea where I'm putting it. And lo and behold, I end up with a packet of seeds that becomes my variation garden seeds. So that's the garden economics project we'll be kicking off. And as I said, so far we're at $110. I will start adding what we're spending on groceries each week to that. And we'll see where we end up at the end of the year. I'm also going to include, if we buy a whole cow or something, I'll probably include that too, but we'll see. Because a cow is not garden economics, but we do buy a whole cow and it's kind of expensive all at once. Although if you divide it out by week, it's not that bad. Okay. Ready for the final segment? It's Dances with Ducks. This is all related to last week's show when I talked to you about how not to lose your mind in the spring. Because you can just back off on your plans and set your priority for the week. And your priority might be getting the tomato seeds in the trays. That was my priority last week. Guess what happened? No tomato seeds in trays. That's what happened. The ducks found the pond. And we've had it mostly blocked off, and they just didn't know it was there. I've had the ducks for almost a year. And this week, they found the pond, and you can only imagine how joyous the ducks were when they found the pond. They had a great time. It was kind of fun to watch them, but I knew that was trouble. And the reason I knew that was trouble is the man who built this property had ducks. I think that's why there's a pond. And his ducks would stay in the pond, and then raccoons and coyotes would come get the ducks. Now, if you know much about ducks, when there's a pond, they'll sleep either towards the edge or in the middle of the pond at night. And that's awesome. That helps keep them from getting eaten. Except when your pond is something that a raccoon can walk across. So it's not a very deep pond. It's not a very large pond. It's sort of a runoff area that's a pond on the property. And that is why predators get ducks here. And the guy who built the property originally tried to just fence everything in and keep the predators out. And as I understand it, that didn't work. So we did the only logical thing. There was the scene where I was in my muck boots in the pond in the middle of the night, like herding ducks back up the hill into the coop to keep them safe. And then the next morning I got up early and I fenced in all of the little holes. Like I blocked them all off so the ducks couldn't go to the pond. Said, I'm done. Walked into the house, started recording a podcast, as a matter of fact. And then I got a text message in the middle of recording the podcast. If you hear an awkward pause in the last one, it's because I got I got a text message in the middle of recording that. And usually nobody bothers me when I'm doing it, but that time, well, let's just say I needed to be bothered because guess what? The ducks found the creek. Now let me tell you something. Ducks finding the creek is way worse than ducks finding the pond because the creek goes all the way to the Caney Fork River, which goes all the way to I think the Tennessee River or anyway, eventually they end up in the Mississippi River and out into the ocean. And that might not seem like that's what would happen with your ducks that find the creek, but it's totally what happens to other people around here with this same kind of duck. They find the creek, they hang out for a few days, they go further and further away every day, they never come home. Next thing you know, no more ducks. Worse, they're sitting in the creek at night. And there's coyotes. And there's raccoons. And there's other people's dogs. So you see where this is going, right? So the ducks found the creek. And as soon as I was done recording last week about how not to lose my mind in the spring, I looked at the picture and I lost my mind. I only lost it for a little while, though. I did what I was supposed to do. And I took a step back. Just like you're supposed to do. I breathed for a minute. I talked to Mark a bit about what we were going to do, and we decided to leave them in the creek for now because they were having a great time, and we didn't have anywhere really good to put them, and to spend a little time fencing off our driveway temporarily so that we could herd the ducks back and keep them in for the rest of the day, meanwhile getting ready to do something bigger because obviously once ducks find water, you're screwed. So we did that. And that night we herded the ducks up, and this is where a fun thing happened. So I call it the Gadsden flag moment. So I'm out there. I'm in jeans and a sundress because it was like warm but cold, and so I had a sundress on, but it was too cold. And I didn't have any leggings, so I put jeans on and muck boots. So I already looked a little silly, and then I'm looking at I'm looking around. What can I herd the ducks with? Oh, there's that Gadsden flag, and it's like a little one. It's not like a tiny, tiny one, but it's like the flag is the size of an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper. For those of you who don't know what a Gadsden flag is, it's the yellow one that says "Don't tread on me." So I've had this thing for years, and it's just kind of sitting in the screened-in porch, and I grab it, and I'm walking down our road. Nobody ever drives down our road, by the way. And we're getting the ducks, and the way we do this is we look at the creek and we're like, okay, they'll come out here. And they're down there. So Mark goes down there on the other side of them and herds them towards me. Once they see me, they're like, oh no, and they'll run up the bank. And then we have to like pop up onto the road, which is right by the creek, and herd them towards our driveway. And they do, like, when they get near the house, they're like, oh yeah, I live there. I'm going to go. I mean, like, they know where to go. And they're used to me putting them away every day. So they're fairly responsive, except for if they get scared. So, of course, this happens. It's the one time somebody comes down the road in a truck. I'm running around in a sundress and jeans and a Gadsden flag. The only thing I don't have is my stupid sombrero, which I totally wear all summer long to keep myself from getting sunburned. So I don't look as ridiculous as I could, but I look totally ridiculous. Mark is herding the ducks. I'm like signing for them to stop because if they drive up to the ducks are going to scatter in all the directions, and then we have to let them calm down and start all over. So the guy stops, and he's got this like crazy lady waving a Gadsden flag. And we herd them up, and they get put away, and then the people go by, and I waved, and my mailbox was vandalized last week. I'm wondering if they decided I was some sort of weird white supremacist or something, because for some silly reason people like to associate that flag with white supremacy, even though it has nothing to do with it. Yeah. So anyway, that was a little fun adventure. So we get them up there, we fenced them off, Got him to bed safely that night, and then I spent friggin' hours talking about, working on, and generally herding ducks around, trying to figure out what we were going to do. And finally, we decided what we should do is move the coop to where the pole barn is going to go someday and fence that in properly so that they are fenced in. Now, you need to know something about my ducks. They don't fly. They're runner ducks. That doesn't mean they don't hop over the occasional fence, but they basically don't. They're runner ducks, so I don't have to clip their wings. I did that on purpose because I didn't want to fool around with clipping wings every, 6 months or so. However, ducks are also fearful. And that means when you're herding them somewhere new, they may not want to go where you want to go. So needless to say, tomatoes still didn't get started. The day that we decided to move the ducks' coop, we realized, this will be way easier with the tractor. Tractor is 20 miles away from here. So Mark and our friend loaded up, went out to the other farm, hopped into the tractor, and one of them drove. They spent an hour and a half driving 20 miles in the tractor with the other one behind with flashing lights. That means we have the tractor back, which is great. We're going to get so much done with that. But that took half the day. And I figured out that day that I could probably start grazing the ducks in one field that's already fenced in, but it had weeds taller than me. So I weed whacked while they were driving. And I looked around and I realized, you know what? All that fencing I just bought to fence in the pole barn area, totally don't need to put it up. You know why? Because this is fenced in and I can just move the coop here. So when they got there, I was like, hey guys, what if we just move the coop there? They're like, great idea. However, ducks are going to bed right now. So we got the ducks into their other, we hadn't moved the coop yet. Tractor was there. Got them into the coop. Decided the next morning we'd herd the ducks into that pasture, close them in for the day, and eventually move the coop in, and then hopefully they'd go into their coop and blah, blah, blah. Again, with animals, the best laid plans never work. I spent the day chasing the occasional duck back into that pasture because there was the occasional duck hole. And then we did the bee inspection, and eventually we hooked the tractor up to the coop, and this part actually went easily and moved it in there. And then the ducks didn't want to go into it. So last night I had to go do my all ducks go to bed thing with my rake where I chase them around. And the funny thing is they did finally go in there. Nobody died last night. It took 2 trips to Tractor Supply. And I'm really grumpy about them because they were not very helpful. My patience was already low and they were rude to me. So I'm like, I need this kind of fencing. There's no reason to be rude when I ask for fencing. But they were kind of rude. And I don't know, it just reminded me of priorities. Like we set priorities in the spring, and a big part of our priority here is to grow our own food. Part of the food we grow are duck eggs, which we also sell. And we do eat the occasional duck, but we haven't done that much because we just like them too much. But animals are also very unpredictable. Like we're getting ready to add goats right now, and I'm kind of looking around at the ducks going, okay, so if they added that much, it took me the whole week. That's all I did. All I did this week was make sure ducks didn't die, by the way. The ducks didn't die. So we were successful there. But I did not make the one thing happen I was going to make. I had a different one thing. So I don't know. I didn't lose my mind. And this week we will get the tomatoes done and the ducks are safe. So that's good. But do I really need to add goats? It made me step back a little further. So there's an off chance we won't add goats this year. We're still thinking about it. On the other hand, the one thing I did realize was that there are ways I can get around the I have block time in my garden thing that got replaced by duck dancing. And the way is to have the things ready to go. So as I said earlier, my seeds are in order and I can now go seed things one at a time in between things and probably get a lot done. So I'll let you know next week if I manage to get back on track with the garden schedule. I'm pretty sure I will. Okay, guys, if you liked the show or hated it, or want to tell me to saw it off, or want to tell me good job, or share a resource like that person did with the chicken tractor, drop me an email at nicolesauce@gmail.com or add thoughts and questions at livingfreeintennessee.com. It is so nice this time of year to go outside in the morning with my cup of coffee and watch the world go by for a few minutes before diving into the day. And despite all the ducky duties this week, things are still moving forward at the Holler Homestead. My online ordering for coffee may not be done like it was supposed to last week, and my e-guide might not be written, but we know it will get done. It's just going to be about a week late. And, I still have not quite lost my mind this late on this day in late February, so I guess we're doing something right? I'll probably even work on that book on my way to Idaho. Anyway, thank you so much for joining me today here on Living Free in Tennessee. And guys, go out and make it a great week.